We cannot hear you very well.
I have a microphone. And,
Maybe that will help. Because it's a summer class, a lot of students are doing it, have their job too, so we record this.
Okay.
It seems to kick off, but
Yeah.
do you hear that?
Yeah, it sounds really good now. It sounds really good now.
Yeah, this microphone, it seemed to me when someone else starts a meeting, it cuts out, but since it hooked in, I think we're good. I don't know if it's a difference between the university's Zoom connection and others, but anyway, that's good. I'll use this.
Yeah, so I make sure you can share screen. Yeah, you can share screen now.
Okay.
From your laptop, I think from your computer, that would be easier. Can you try that?
Yeah, it looks like that.
Yeah. So you just present from your laptop, from your computer. Yeah.
Okay. And then do you want me to keep the video on or off?
No, so we already doing it. You need to do anything.
Okay, just leave it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, let's wait for a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
So we got a CO2 sensor. It's like
Excellent.
less than $200 or something. So we are trying for different location now in Newmark, and we will try to monitor the CO2 in a classroom here in Newmark once that starts.
Yeah, and have you used it in some rooms so far and seen anything?
Yeah, so right now there's not a whole lot of people, so we are trying to do it in the lab where students are working. So we are working on that. But I want to make sure that the sensor is working, and we also log the data. And we want to also to use the data for students to learn data processing, all that stuff.
Could you send me a note with what you picked as a sensor?
Yeah, I will definitely share that with you. Later this week, because we are still testing.
Oh, good. And then with Brian Deal and Robert Namath and Todd Rusk at CDAC, I think there's some good potential for synergism between your group and theirs, where they're kind of like an extension group, like the agriculture extension.
Yeah, I think that would be really good, so whatever I can do, we can do to disseminate the knowledge, that we do it.
So.
Yes, so I think we have a meeting later today, right? Later today.
Yeah, 1:30.
Yeah, 1:30. Yes, that will definitely work for us. Okay, very good. So hello everyone, and of course this lecture is recorded, and I am very happy to introduce to you Professor Newell, and he's after years, many years teaching and doing research at University of Illinois. Now he's a professor emeritus, and he also have a private practice to further the science and practice of ventilation. So without any further ado, I would like Professor Newell to give us a presentations on how to protect us against COVID-19. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nguyen. I very much appreciate the invitation to present this material to the class. It's a very odd situation for us where in the academic environment where we're actively discussing something that's directly impacting us more significantly than anything I can think of over my lifetime. And as you mentioned, I'm retired and old and decrepit, and so I go back quite a few decades. And so I hope to give you some understanding where I'm coming from as far as the built environment, the indoor environment, and what's needed to, in our viewpoint, keep us healthy, keep us at peak thinking capability, cognition, keep us productive, and help us to sleep. All those things that go into making us feel well. But this COVID-19 infection that's running rampant here and throughout the world has interfered with our ability to do that. And this is something that's within what we concentrate on and look at. The built environment must keep us healthy also by reducing the probability we're going to get sick. And so all of those things are rolled up in this discussion. I have a list of references at the end, so as it may feel like a fire hose hitting you, as well as my usual blathering and ranting, that there are some references that are posted at the end of this talk for those who would like to look further into these materials, that you can do that. So this is what I do now. I get to work with these two younger fellows, my son Ben and another U of I grad. It's always great to work with university alums. I think they run some of the best corporations and some of the best activities around the world. And I'm very proud to be associated with the University of Illinois for many reasons. But getting to work with them, so loving every minute on campus during my career there for about 3 decades. And now over the past 10 years plus, working with Ben, who's president of our company, and Alex, the three of us are mechanical engineers, but being on the front line of, in the simplest way, as Aldo Leopold, the originator of the modern natural resources field, stated, how do we live on a piece of land without spoiling it? But our goal as a company, our company is called Build Equinox, is to develop solutions for healthy, comfortable, sustainable lifestyles. Basically, how do we live on our daily allowance of solar energy? And our current focus is on making the built environment healthy. And that's because the energy side, which is also a very big part of our background, how much energy does a house take? How much does it take to cook food, to wash clothes, to drive from here to there, to heat water, to keep us comfortable? We understand that. That's very simple, very straightforward. And now, as you can see, that 2X's tracker panel behind us, located at our business, that we understand the cost of renewable energy, and it competes against fossil fuel, it competes against nuclear, it more than competes. It's just more economical, and there's more jobs per dollar for sustainable technologies than there are for the current technologies. Give you an example, the coal industry in Illinois, which is Illinois is one of the major coal states. It employs fewer people throughout Illinois in the coal industry than we graduate from the University of Illinois each year. We need real jobs for people graduating from our universities each year, and coal ain't it. Solar, wind, as well as the associated technologies for improved energy efficiency. This is where the future are, and the jobs now. And we're very proud that this thing over on the left we call a SERV, a smart ventilation system for residences. We build them right here with parts made throughout the U.S. as well as throughout the world. It's very important to have relations throughout the world and to interact in good, productive manners throughout the world. And we're very proud that our business, which is located in Urbana in a 4,500 square foot Morton building, basically a steel sided farm building. It's 100% solar powered. So it may not be everybody's view of what a solar powered house or business might look like, but it demonstrates that any building could be fully solar powered. And I'm talking to you from my house, what we call Equinox House. And so Build Equinox is meant to try to emulate this Zero Plus house that we built 10 years ago and is a test bed for us. It has Serve Smart ventilation in it. It produces more energy than what it needs over the course of the year. And that excess energy powers the bulk of our transportation with 2 electric cars. And it does so economically. And so that's the mission. For whatever reason, I've been wired up to think that way, but my whole career has been based on, I wouldn't call it a passion, but more of, say, panic, that feeling since the early 70s when I was in college, that we're going 100 miles an hour at a brick wall, and resources need to be conserved. We need to do things more efficiently. We need to live on our daily allowance of solar energy in order to provide future generations, with a prosperous future. But I'm fully convinced that we do not have to play musical chairs. We do not have to sacrifice somebody else's quality of life somewhere in the world. That when we do things in this manner, there is more than enough resources for the world's population to live healthy and comfortably and not have to fight over scarce resources. And that's where I'm coming from. So if you get one thing out of this talk, it's carbon dioxide, and it's your gateway to safe air. As you come back to campus, and I hope you do, and as we'll talk about, I think it may be one of the safer environments to be in, that if you walk into a building and you don't know the carbon dioxide, you don't know the quality of the air, you don't know how much fresh air you're getting, and it's like playing Russian roulette. So one thing I'd urge you is go out and buy a CO2 meter, like this red one that you can get on Amazon for a couple $100. It's got good accuracy. The white one that's showing there is a little more expensive, but really the same thing. And let's see, I've got that one with me right here, and it's reading like 704 parts per million. And the reason for telling you 800 parts per million, we'll go into more detail on that in a bit, but that's essentially means that twice as much fresh air per person is entering this room, this building, this indoor space than what standard ventilation guidelines would be bringing in. And with that doubling of today's standards, which we've known way before COVID that we should be heading this way, but it's like steering an oil tanker. It's just hard to get things moving in this direction. That this improves our health. It reduces your chance of getting the flu or a cold, and your brain functions better at this level of carbon dioxide. You can't sense it. You can't smell the difference between this and standard ventilation. Standard ventilation would give you about 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million, and doubling that airflow level per person would reduce it to about 800, but it definitely has an impact. Now, as you think about flying, I wouldn't. CEOs for airline corporations would say, hey, come and fly, it's safe. You know, we're turning over the air and bringing in lots of fresh air in aircraft, 20 air changes per hour. Well, trust and verify. Measure the CO2. Here's the CO2 on a flight I took from Philly to Vermont. 1,550 parts per million was the average. That's horrible. That's even less than what standard building ventilation would be. I've been on a number of aircraft where, yeah, it's been 800, maybe even 700, 1,000. But you don't know. You can't smell 1,500 parts per million of CO2. and I caught the flu. I don't remember anybody sneezing on me from the seat behind me, but it's going to also, it's an indicator that contagion's being concentrated and your likelihood of getting sick is going up. Now, I recently took a vacation and I got the nose test, and I was just having a little fun with it. Apparently the person doing the testing hadn't seen anybody taking a selfie and reacting in such a manner, but we both had a laugh, and it turned out negative. I wanted to know I was negative before going on a trip, which was a family vacation to South Carolina, which has currently been a hot spot. And I got the results and I was negative, and along the trip, we didn't do the usual things like going out to restaurants. We gassed up. We went in a few convenience stores or got takeout for pizza or barbecue or whatever along the way. Got to the beach area where we were going, and then mostly just grilled out. We're on the beach and outdoors. I think that the test, the spit test the university has developed, and which I did upon returning, and where you get the results within just a few hours, I think this is a game changer. And let me say that where they anticipate being able to do 10,000 tests per day, or 10,000 tests per day, basically able to do the whole campus community within a week, that if this center, which is, as I understand, located in a lab space that they constructed in Vet Med over the summer, if that maybe costs them $10 million for the center and whatever operational costs, and I'm not sure what those are, but I just guessed 10 million, maybe it was $1 million. And if you had 10,000 of them capable of running 10,000 tests a day, within a week, you could test the whole US population and then some. And if that costs 10 million per center and 10,000 of them, that'd be 100 billion. Yeah, it's, well, Jeff Bezos, he's got that much. But, for sure, this is small change compared to the dollars that this economic catastrophe has cost us, basically due to gross mishandling of this disease, a highly predictable infection spread, as we'll be talking about. But just to note how 100 billion relates, the flu and cold, which I assume with this test, you could also test for things like that, as well as bacterial infections and meningitis and maybe other things. That would cost maybe $100 billion to build all of these, but the flu and cold annually costs us 120 billion per year. And the things we're going to talk about, if we do these, in addition to helping us fight COVID and finally snuff it out and get control of it, this should also reduce the impact of colds and flu, which, because of poor ventilation, is higher than what it really needs to be. So along the vacation, I took this trusty red meter and I was measuring a lot of CO2 along the way. Over on the left, the car, when the car's ventilation was in recirculation mode with 3 of us in it, it was about 1,800. And even though we are in, say, a family bubble and know each other and are not infected, all 3 of us were tested beforehand, that when you put the car in fresh air mode, it drops down. And I need all the help in terms of cognition capabilities as I can get. And for sure, driving with 500-600 parts per million is much, much better than 1,800 parts per million. Interestingly enough, high CO2, while people think it makes you sleepy, actually you have a much poorer quality of sleep in high CO2 environments, something that regularly occurs in bedrooms. We went to a barbecue takeout along the way in Kentucky, and people were masking in there, going in, picking up, and I was very pleased to see that, as Kentucky and down south haven't been known for masking effectively, but now it looks like they are, as the spread has gained their attention through the news. Bagel takeout place in North Carolina looked great. 800 parts per million, and number of people going in and out, picking up bagels in the morning. The hotel we stayed at, the lobby was about 1,200, it's like standard ventilation. So barbecue, takeout, hotel lobby were about that. Our hotel room in the morning, like a bedroom in many homes, even leaky, conventionally built homes, was around 3,000, 3,400, indicating our room had very poor ventilation. But because it was my wife and I that the CO2 buildup was from us, and presumably we're not infected or going to infect each other. But for sure, if one of us were infected, the probability that the other would be is very, very high. But in any case, this is bad CO2 for sleep quality. And while it was a very clean hotel and well-run hotel, they need to get some fresh air in there. And then, I had to get some licorice. I'm a licorice addict. So as we gassed up, I went in this convenience store that, who knows what's going to be in there, but it was active with people. Very pleased to see them mass. This was in North Carolina, and a nice CO2 level. I don't know if that meant fresh air was coming in through infiltration leaks or whether they were actively pumping in fresh air, but in either case, that was a good CO2 quality to find. And then we spent a lot of time outside on the beach. The bedroom, my wife and my bedroom in the rental house, was typical of a bedroom without good fresh air ventilation, as 99% or so US bedrooms tend to be. And so it was about 1,700 in the morning in that bedroom, compared to where in our home with the type of ventilation I mentioned, it'll be like 800-900 or 1,000 by morning. And then lots of fresh air. Here, my daughter Melissa is hauling in about a 40-inch cobia, and my son-in-law Bucci and I are enjoying fresh air on a boat. 400 parts per million, can't beat it. Although it used to be 300 when I was born in the early 50s. Well, almost a year ago, I was in England, and I hope to return. And I went to the Florence Nightingale Museum. I've studied her work, and she's brilliant, brilliant person. In the 1850s, she wrote notes on nursing, started the modern era of sanitation and the importance of fresh air in our health. And a quote from her: "Keep the air the patient breathes as pure as the external air without chilling them." And they had in Florence Nightingale, interestingly enough, last October, a special exhibit on the Spanish flu, but really the world pandemic. There's some information that seems to indicate it really started in Fort Riley, Kansas, and came out of the US, spread to Europe through our troops going over for World War I. But in any case, very nice graphic display of the geography of the flu spread and the time spread, the three waves from the initial spring 1918 wave into the fall wave, and then into the late winter spring third wave. And we'll talk about that some and why this one is so different from that. Not only the virus, but some of the characteristics due to the way our buildings are managed. So in this outline, I first just want to hit some guidelines we've put out and talk about that a bit. Guidelines for reopening businesses safely, guidelines for what you do, because you can stay safe even if other people are not being safe. Then we'll talk a little bit about virus transmission, and of course this could be several lectures alone on all the different aspects of it. I'll talk a little bit conceptually about the modeling that I do in disease transmission, and primarily trying to understand what we need to do inside of the built environment for ventilation that keeps us healthy, an area that Professor Wynn and her faculty colleagues have been very active in. And so if you have an interest in that, perhaps her or some of her colleagues in her research group are looking for folks to work as undergraduate research assistants. There's just tons of activity on campus, and one of the reasons why it is such an excellent university to study at. And then some parameters that you won't hear about elsewhere because they're in the model I developed, and so they're my own definitions, but they relate to other more conventional models. But to me, this gives me some direction. And with that, we'll talk about the summer surge, modeling predictions that explain why the summer surge has happened and where we've been. And then going into the fall, as people are freaking out, and rightfully so, as it just seems like we're blindly bumbling into a future without really any indication of what might happen and what we do if it does happen. So this lack of coordination, this lack of a coherent set of guidance for the country as a whole, it's really impacting us. And without getting into too much ranting on that, as people try to rewrite history, let me just say very directly, this catastrophe, this historic disaster in the United States is all of our own making. There are people responsible, and we should have been able to handle this like many countries in Europe, like in Germany or in Italy, which preceded us in infection growth, but then demonstrated how to get that runaway infection under control, as well as South Korea and many other countries that have managed it. So, so we're going to look at where we're going and some of the impacts of school reopenings, and then and the effect of outdoor temperature, which does have an effect, but surprisingly different than the effect viewed in 1918. So reopening guidelines. Here's a screenshot of the smart ventilation system in my house. And we're a tiny company. There's maybe 400 of these units now, what we call a SERV. And service, a SERV intelligently controlled environment, is our online control and analytics screen. So these units are online. They're also over-the-air upgradable, just like a Tesla. And we came out with that capability 5, 6, 7 years ago, about the same time Tesla introduced that capability. And I always like to tell U of I students that Tesla was really, truly founded by a University of Illinois alum, Martin Eberhard. You can look that up on your own. But then, of course, whoever owns the most shares gets to call the shots and take over the company whenever they want. And so, very interesting direction, but read up for yourselves if you're interested. So in my house, when I took this screenshot, the CO2 was around 617. I typically try to keep the house at about 800 or so parts per million of CO2. And you can go to our business website, buildequinox.com. And on the front page, if you look at the section that says take control, you'll see live screen data from our unit. You can go into all the controls, and hopefully you're not sophisticated enough to know how to get in and make the controls actually work. They've been disengaged, but it allows you to see all the features of a SERV in actual operation. And as I mentioned, keeping it below 800, that's our first guideline. This indicates essentially double the standard ventilation of buildings, and this reduces the probability that you're going to get sick, reduces the concentration of contagion. Also, where standard filtration, if there are filters in the airstream somewhere in a central furnace or air conditioner, most likely it's a MERV 8, which is there just to protect the heat exchanger coils from dust particles laying on it, but big dust particles, not the type of particulates that get deep into your lungs, what are often called 2.5 micron particulates, not particulates that are laden with virus or droplets that have come out of some infectious person's lungs. But if you do upgrade that to a MERV 11, 13, or 16, and a MERV 16 is equivalent to a HEPA filter, which you may have also heard of, that MERV 13 and 16 gets you to where about 90% of virus-laden mass, virus-laden particulates will be filtered out of the airstream. This is another important contribution to reducing contagion in the air. And then a third to consider, and right now, if you try to order an ultraviolet bulb to add to a duct, you'll find quite a bit of delay, as this is a place to invest if you have some money. It's just skyrocketing, and I think this will become mainstream technology, but it's an old technology. We've known this since the 30s when it was shown to effectively handle the spread of tuberculosis, another airborne disease, and that with ultraviolet, it's not a hard, these are not tanning bulbs. These are a different wavelength than tanning bulbs. But these bulbs takes about 0.02 watts of ultraviolet per CFM of airflow for about 85% single kill efficiency. And so about 4 watts of ultraviolet, which would handle about 200 CFM, about what we use in residences. This is about a 16 watt bulb. The conversion from electric energy to UV radiant output is about 25%. And 16 watts per bulb is about 5 cents per day cost to operate that. Not much relative to the value of your health and productivity and the safety of the ones around you. And then an additional 3 for public places like restaurants, businesses, Department of Motor Vehicles, schools, elsewhere, to consider adding ultraviolet surface sanitizing in addition to washing and spraying, as you're seeing so many people doing. One study out of a hospital in Vancouver, Canada, showed that by using this, which is basically a bank of ultraviolet bulbs that could either be robotic, as it can move room to room automatically, and then sensing the dose, it's spreading throughout the room, but doing that during unoccupied periods of the day, say at nighttime when place is being cleaned, that or just manually this thing is wheeled in from one room to another, switched on for a period of time as the custodial staff might be cleaning other rooms. But one study at a hospital in Vancouver, Canada, where they studied 700 rooms over the course of a year that had been occupied by infectious persons, not with COVID, but with other contagions. And the rooms showed about 34% of the surfaces, as I recall, but I have this study cited at the end, had traces of contagion on it. Some, I think these were bacterial, like some of the drug-resistant, antibiotic-resistant germs that we're now seeing. And after disinfecting and washing surfaces down, 30% still had traces of contagion on it. And after ultraviolet surface sanitation, basically just spraying the room with ultraviolet for maybe 15 minutes or a half hour in a safe manner, no people in there, and materials that can also withstand the ultraviolet, that it dropped it down to about 3% of the surfaces still showed a sign of contagion, a remarkable drop, and something that I think beyond medical facilities where this is more common, but to the common built environment, restaurants and elsewhere, that we might consider utilizing this technology, classrooms, other places of that nature. And face masks are extremely important. And we'll discuss that a little bit more, but especially important, as everybody mostly knows now, for catching contagion coming out of you as you're speaking and breathing, which essentially reduces the emission source of contagion and makes it so that there's that less of a concentration, as well as protecting you. And hopefully we do get more into the business of masks that are protecting in both directions. And then staying much more than 6 feet away from anyone not wearing a mask. This is a fallacy that 6 feet is a safe distance. You need to maybe not actively shame, as that, as you see on the news, somebody in a Walmart getting in a fight but just stay away, 20, 30 feet away, shun them. So anyone not wearing a mask, if you think of somebody puffing on a cigarette and blowing a smoke ring, think of that as a little cloud of contagion floating past your head 20 feet down the aisle. That's what the contagion is doing within the built environment. CO2 is a surrogate, as well as impacting you directly as far as your cognition capability, your quality of sleep. It is also a surrogate for a tracer gas telling you the concentration of contagion. And so this plot that I've made, I've used something called the Wells-Riley equation, which is a relation developed years ago, but to look at the probability of becoming infected, ingesting an infectious dose of an airborne contagion. And your probability is determined by the carbon dioxide level as a surrogate for fresh airflow into a space, and the time that you're in that environment. So in this model, I assumed one infected person that is spewing out contagion, and 3 uninfected, and carbon dioxide is a direct measure of the fraction of air that you're breathing that came from someone else's lungs. And 25% of that, in this case, came from an infected person's lungs with the contagion. And 75%, some was from you, and the rest was from the other people in the room. And so this is what determines the carbon dioxide balance. And if you're, say, in an office space or in a house for 8 hours with one infected person, and you get up above 1,000 parts per million of CO2, you've got more than a 90% chance of becoming infected. And you can see the less time you spend and the more you can get the inside, like outside at 400 parts per million, the lower your probability of getting sick. The cognition improvement, when you go from about 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million of CO2, where standard ventilation keeps you, you will have about a 10% increase brain function. This is in areas of decision making, creativity, focus, organization of information, a number of things that have been quantified in testing. And again, as you can't smell the difference in the air, most people cannot sense a difference in air quality between these. Our current standards are based on an odor test, and that's around 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. That's where about 20% of the populace is not satisfied with the air quality. And the current standards came out of the 1930s, where a researcher at Yale, and even though it's gone through a variety of twists and turns, it still basically comes back to that as the reference where our standards have been set today. They put a recently washed, clean clothed person in a sealed chamber and blew air through at 5 CFM, 5 cubic feet per minute, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. And they had people sniffing the air, a large number of people sniffing the air at the outlet from that sealed chamber. And the person inside was sedentary, just sitting at a desk, maybe reading, couldn't play video games at that time that I know of. And when only 20% of the people sniffing that air were dissatisfied with the quality of the air, but at a time when we didn't know that that also impacted brain function and cognition productivity, that's where the standard was set, which is roughly 20 cubic feet per minute per person in a room. And that puts you at about 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. And up until just the last 5 to 10 years before this cognition productivity study started to be investigated, we assumed CO2 at that level was benign, did not have any impact, because the impact of 10% cognition degradation is not really noticeable. Some people have likened it to maybe drinking a light beer. So I mentioned filters being very important, upgrading to MERV 13 to 16. And if you're in a place like out west where the outside air might not be that good either because of forest fires, which we see out in the West Coast and the Intermountain area in a number of homes, or inside where there's just other chemical emissions from cleaners, cleansers, kitty litter, and other things, cooking, that this bottom filter can also remove volatile organic compounds, actually more absorptive capacity than activated carbon. And this lower technology comes from a local startup company named Sirionics that Professor Economy in Material Science and some colleagues have started. And it's a very exciting technology, I think. I think another important contributor to improving air quality in the built environment. And then ultraviolet. We just recently introduced an ultraviolet bulb, and while it seems to be jumping on the UV bandwagon, we actually have had this under test for more than 2 years, because when you put an ultraviolet bulb inside of a machine you're building, you need to make sure you're not degrading components in the machine. Various polymers are very susceptible to UV degradation. And so it just happened that we finished the testing, had done the design to integrate this into our unit. And so we monitor how many hours it's on when somebody needs to change a bulb, basically once a year, where filters once every 3 months. And for about 5 cents a day, that you get this additional kill efficiency on top of filtration efficiency to get contagion out. So when you take our basic guidelines, the upper red circle shows for an 8-hour day with this 1 infected and 3 susceptible, and this is using the same Wells-Riley modeling, but shown in a little different format. And then the red circle shows today's current building ventilation standards. The upper 3 are residential standards. ASHRAE, which is an engineering society I belong to and does a lot of good things, but they need to up their ventilation. They call it adequate ventilation, and adequate is not healthy ventilation. But there are 2 standards, what's still in use, 62.2 2010 and 62.2 2019, that has a little bit higher airflow, but not much and not enough. And then the passive house, which is another high efficiency housing standard, but they all fall in roughly the same line. If you have somebody that's infected with COVID and they're putting out 100 quanta per hour, and a quanta is an infectious dose. It's not necessarily a viral particle. Instead, it's an amount of viral contagion that if you inhale, it has an exponential nature to it. If you inhale 1 quanta, you're 63% likely to develop a disease. If you inhale 2, about 90%, 3, about 95%. And so it's got that exponential nature to it as far as the probability you're going to get sick. But you can see that all 3 of these residential building standards, and we rarely find homes with that good of air quality, so it's even worse. Somebody infectious comes to your house, another family member, another housemate, you're most likely going to get sick if you spend time with them in that house. And that is where a lot of the infection transmission is occurring. And the rule of thumb, 20 CFM per person, this 1934 guideline, it's actually a bit better than today's housing standards, but still you're 90, 95% assured, basically quite certain you're going to get sick if somebody infected comes in. You double the fresh air ventilation, you knock that down to about 75%. You add a more effective filter, a MERV 13, MERV 16. You knock that down to 60%. You add ultraviolet air purification, sanitation. You knock that down to 50%. That is significant. Now you're to where you're at least flipping a coin if you have to spend an amount of time there. In a public space or in the home, you add a face mask. So now you're putting out 50 quanta per hour because the mask is catching enough droplets with about half of your emission. Maybe a more effective mask is pulling 90% out, like an N95 mask. So it goes down that much more, but just removing 50% with a hand stitched mask of typical fabric knocks you down to 50% with doubling fresh air, knocks you down below 40% with improved filtration, and knocks you down to 30% by adding ultraviolet. Okay. So we know we can improve the built environment. And let me mention that one of the cited references from Professor Milton, who studies disease transmission for decades, you'll find a number of papers by Donald Milton out of the University of Maryland, formerly at Harvard. But he has shown with over 3,000 employees for a New England firm, this was a study done more than 10 years ago, but pre-COVID, that buildings, and so 3,000 employees scattered over a few dozen buildings, and they looked at buildings that had high ventilation rates, say 40 to 50 CFM, and buildings that had lower ventilation rates but standard, 20 CFM per person. And they found 40% fewer sick days in the buildings with the increased ventilation. This was before we also knew of the cognition productivity decrease with standard ventilation. A 40% reduction in sick days in the higher ventilated buildings was basically one sick day. The average employee had 2 to 3 sick days per year. And this reduction, whether or not, and influenza is not considered an airborne disease in the same manner that COVID has not been by the CDC and World Health Organization, but still reducing the amount of contagion with better ventilation significantly reduces the probability you're going to catch a cold or the flu and have a sick day. And the same whether your sick day is because someone else in your family and you need to take the day off. And this has a significant cost that is about 10 times more than the cost of the associated building energy to increase ventilation to this. So as people say, it's too much energy, we can't ventilate at that level, they're absolutely wrong. And my background is on the energy side, and I can tell you this very directly that it's worth it. It's a significant payback improvement. Just a little bit about the airborne debate. CDC and WHO, World Health Organization, they're starting to come around. Why it's been such a difficult debate and has been ongoing for so many years, why they try to paint it so black and white, but they have just stuck to the standard script that of the 3 paths that things are divided into, but it's much more complicated than that. That big droplets, big loogies coming at you when you sneeze and cough, and then fomites, those surfaces around you when you sneeze and cough or get respiratory droplets, that this is where you get infected and that airborne aerosols are secondary. This is false. I absolutely think this picture that I've shown, this 6-foot distance and this aerosol, this is just not the actual picture. So let's discuss a little more detail, but not a lot of depth. Again, look at the cited references at the back. Follow the work of Professor Marr, Lindsay Marr out of Virginia Tech. Follow the work of Professor Brent Stevens out of IIT. Follow the work of Donald Milton at the University of Maryland to get a much better picture. Follow the work of Professor Lisa Bruiba out of MIT about and follow our own work with Professor Wynn and Professor in environmental engineering on these different transmission mechanisms. We who work in fluid mechanics, we who work in aerosols and particulates, we know that these other mechanisms should be considered significant. Bruiba's work, this kind of aerosol cloud, and as I mentioned, a smoke ring, she's demonstrated that when you sneeze and cough, there's this homogeneous cloud layer that's actually buoyant that goes 20, 30 feet away from the person coughing and sneezing. It doesn't just drop within 6 feet. That ventilation then can take a coherent structure of concentrated contagion and move it around a room, as has been shown in various restaurants where the ventilation system looks like it moved infectious agents past people at other tables and cause their infection. And of course, the higher the concentration of contagion due to inadequate ventilation means that there's going to be more contagion settling on surfaces. So the concentration of contagion on surfaces, what we call fomites, that there's a more likelihood you're going to get an infectious dose from touching or rubbing against that, and more cleaning and sanitation needed to remove that. And then let me say, and this is a study by Professor Brent Stevens, and I don't know why it's not getting, at least I'm not noticing as much attention on it in the general press as people are looking for these different reasons. But he ran a very unique study a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, but he took a residence size laboratory experiment, like a small apartment, maybe 800,000 square foot, with a central ventilation system. And then he had this kind of cough respiratory machine that had a mucus laden solution that would either be seeded with a bacterial or a viral component. And then he looked at the spread of these droplets that were either viral or bacterial laden throughout that space, and how the ventilation led to certain amounts of droplets hitting settle plates that he had placed throughout the room, as well as air sampling tubes. And today, with the miracle of fast genetic material analysis, RNA and DNA analyses, he could measure the viral mass and bacterial mass that was deposited on the floor throughout the space, as well as in the airstream. And what was so interesting about his study, and this is showing up in studies like from the University of Nebraska in their isolation rooms, they're known for handling the most contagious of diseases and the most difficult diseases like Ebola. And as COVID cases initially came into the country through the cruise ships that were brought back, a number of those folks went to University of Nebraska, and they found results that mirrored what Professor Stevens' work at IIT has shown, that bacterial laden droplets, and bacteria tend to be droplet size, maybe 2, 3 or so microns in size, about the size level of a lot of droplets that come out of our respiration and sneezing and coughing. And the bacterial droplets impacted the size population of the droplets emitted. And most of that bacterial laden droplet mass was found, say, within about 6 feet of this machine that was breathing and periodically coughing droplets out. When he seeded the mucus material with a viral agent, and both of these are non-lethal, non-toxic agents, but to act similar to the real deal, the viral laden droplets had a much different size population. They did not drop within 6 feet, but instead there was very little droplet mass and viral mass detected within 6 feet. The maximum amount of mass was located more at around 9 to 10 feet. And then even further, a significant fraction of the viral mass, and not knowing whether or not that viral mass was then active, which is another area of debate and concern. But still, the fact that within this realistic environment, very little viral mass within 6 feet, a lot of viral mass uh, around 9 to 10 feet, and then a significant fraction of viral mass further than that, much more than what was found within 6 feet. And then on top of it, as he circulated air with a typical air handler, typical furnace air conditioning circulation system at typical rates, 5, 6, 800 CFM for this apartment size residence, that he found that a MERV 8 filter, the standard furnace filter, and no filter were essentially the same. And when he used a MERV 11 and a MERV 16 filter, he found that for the viral laden droplets, as well as the bacterial, but the viral laden droplets, the much tinier contagion, much less than a micron in size, that he was able to remove 85 to 95% with the MERV 11 to MERV 16 filters of the viral mass from the airstream. And so this question of how to remove a very tiny viral particle, it is attached. It's either in a droplet nuclei, a reduced and evaporated, what had formerly been a droplet, or some other particulate that the viral mass may have adhered to, but that you can effectively remove that. As we consider different built environments, we need to think about them differently. A house which is actually very low density, say about 1,000 square feet per person in typical US residences, having at least a MERV 11, I'd recommend MERV 13 or greater filter, continuous recirculation. And then as you get into more complex homes, and a complex home would be, say, a home that's getting larger than 2,500 to 3,000 square feet, one where the airflow needed to manage a typical US home has 2 to 3 occupants and running around 200 cubic feet per minute. But as you get to, say, a number of homes we're in, 3, 4, 5,000, 10,000 square feet, we still tend to find that these might just be two old people like my wife and I shuffling around in the house. So there's kind of this pollutant contagion cloud moving with us. And other parts of the house are fairly fresh. And so as you get into more complex homes, today's wireless sensors, carbon dioxide sensors, volatile organic compound sensors, and comfort sensors, temperature, humidity, these can see where you are and where you need to address fresh air more directly, which has an efficiency component to it, as well as keeping that air where you are in better control. And you can find 2 reports on smart air ventilation and smart air distribution on our website. There's a publication, multimedia section that has some reports that go through detailed computer simulation studies we've done, as well as field measurements on these things. Medium density, as you get to a school and office that about 100 square feet per person, that you really need to locally monitor that classroom. Each classroom, every room within a building should be monitored for carbon dioxide, and fresh air needs to be brought in to that space, and in the manner that that person would like to have their air quality. This 20% dissatisfaction metric that's been used to set our air quality standards and odor-based standard, 20% dissatisfaction is horrendous. And significant studies with over 30,000 surveyed, and this is done by University of California at Berkeley Center for the Built Environment. They found that 80% of buildings do not even make the level where only 20% of its inhabitants are dissatisfied. And 20% dissatisfied doesn't mean 80% are satisfied. It means maybe there's 30, 40, 50% that are, no, they're not satisfied, they're not dissatisfied. And so we don't even make that poor metric. And a big part of it is lack of a person, whether they have significant chemical sensitivities or other environmental sensitivities or asthma or allergenic sensitivities, is not giving people the ability to control that local space as they desire, both temperature, humidity, as well as air quality. And then there's a high density transportation, buses, airplanes, packed restaurants. We need very dynamic control. We need very specific control. We need much better air quality than this flight from Philly to Burlington. And we need to have something that tells us that of that air quality. We should be able to look on our phone. We should be able to see a meter on the wall that directly is telling us, here is the CO2 level in this space. If you don't know CO2, you're playing Russian roulette. Here's a simulation. There's a 5-minute simulation. Air quality is very, very dynamic. So we look at some real data. But this is for the US average new constructed house is about 2,700 square feet and has about 2.5 occupants. But figuring this would be a 4-bedroom home with 5 occupants, putting a time schedule of when they're sleeping, when they're out of the house. So 8 to 4, they're out of the house, 4 to 10, they're back home and active. 10 to 6 are sleeping. So they're in bedrooms where they're producing CO2 as well as emitting contagion if they're infectious. 6 to 8, they're up and at it again and then out of the house. And using ASHRAE ventilation and dividing it up. So ASHRAE standard would say you'd use 120 CFM of continuous airflow in this house rather than sensed air quality as we do in a smart ventilation system. And if we put 60 CFM of that 120 in the main room and 20 CFM in the master bedroom with 2 people and 10 CFM in the other bedrooms with a single person, on average, this orange line or brown line, it looks okay. But in the main room, when people get up in the morning, it starts to climb. 60 CFM is not enough for 5 occupants. And then when they come back home from being away for 8 hours a day, it skyrockets again. This room will have a problem. The bedrooms aren't so bad. This is actually pretty good for a bedroom. But if I took, say, 5, 10 CFM from the bedrooms and put that with the 60 to try to get this down, it's like squeezing Jello. These are going to pop up to undesirable levels, affecting sleep quality, causing you to get infected if someone else in that room is infected. And so it's just not enough ventilation. And if someone is sick and they're staying in their room with this level of ventilation, which again, this is what the standard ventilation for a home would be, and that room would be getting about 10 CFM. One person in that room for 24 hours a day, the CO2 would be this level and the concentration of contagion would be sky high. The reason for this variation is that this model also takes into account the impact of wind. When the wind's blowing, there's more extra infiltrated fresh air into the house, and when the wind's not blowing, there's less. Well, here's a real house, and this is why you need 5-minute or less dynamic simulation. This is a 3-bedroom house, 2 adults and 3 kids, 2 young kids that share a bedroom, this gray line. And they're like 3 and 5 years old at this time. When they go to bed, parents shut the door because, you know, they're making noise and trying to get out of bed and stuff like that. And it skyrockets. And then about 9 o'clock, when the noise settles down, the parents open the door and it's levels off. But you can just see it goes up to undesirable levels every night. If one of these kids is infected, the other's going to get sick. And sure enough, that is what happens. The rest of the house, and this is a 1950s era leaky house, and I can't tell you how many times people tell me, oh, I don't need fresh air ventilation. I live in a leaky house. I tell them, when the wind's not blowing, you've got horrendous air quality problems. If you got a 20-mile-an-hour wind, yeah, then maybe in this room or that room. But where leaks occur and where you live are two different things. The leaks typically are not in the bedroom. It's in the laundry room with the laundry vent. It's in the kitchen with the kitchen vent, or a mechanical room with a furnace vent. And that's where the infiltrated air is moving through, causing a drop in energy efficiency, but not improving the air quality you're living in. Now, this is actually my house, what we call Equinox House, but showing smart ventilation. And I have the set point at 850 parts per million at this time when this data was taken. And again, you can see this live on our website. You can look back through, say, 4 years or so of data since we've been online, and look at it, time periods when we're home, when we have a party here with a bunch of people, and when we don't. But this is basically just two old people living here, my wife and I, and whenever, so this yellow line is the CO2 going back to the serve unit. When it would hit 850, the serve goes from a recirculation mode, and recirculation is essential, as we were discussing, for filtering out particulates, to drop it down by 100 parts per million to 750. So you can see that once it hit this threshold, it dropped it down, and then it's kind of coasting and in recirculation where it's pulling particulates out. And then for whatever reason that it goes up again and hits this threshold again, it's triggered into fresh air ventilation. It drops it down to this threshold again, and then it does whatever. If it's windy outside, the leaks add a little extra fresh air and perhaps keep us from hitting this threshold. And then these other three lines are three monitoring boxes, one in the master bedroom, one in an unused bedroom, and then one in the main room. And there's some time shifting from when we're in the main room to in the bedroom over the course of, this was about a 3-day period. But basically you can see that we don't have any wild excursions. In our case, we just have a simple system without zone dampering and local sensing. But with the new generation unit that we have that has extended capabilities, we're putting that in to demonstrate it. But this house is a 2,000 square foot house that really just needs the basic system to manage air quality under the conditions we experience. But you can see it doesn't run away up to 2,000 like we saw in that other conventional house. And so it manages it, you get good sleep quality, and you have a certainty that the air you're breathing is being automatically controlled. Now here's a medium density commercial building. And in this building, it's about 25,000 square foot facility we monitored. We had about 6 different monitoring stations. It has about 120 employees. The annual utility bill, which is actually quite large because it had a large computer server room in it that was like a big toaster oven sucking energy in. But compared to payroll, it pales. So even though this is a pretty big utility bill for this size facility, it pales compared to the annual payroll. And so when we look at the impact of improving the air quality, and so this green line is an average of the 6 measurement stations, but they all mirrored this plus or minus so much CO2. And this slight inflection is lunchtime. Some people would leave during lunch and then come back. And we could for sure build that into this brown line as our simulation model of the building. We could take employees out and simulate this, but we just wanted something that somewhat replicated the way the building operated. And when we bumped the ventilation up in our simulation model to keep them below 1,000 parts per million, and we looked at the energy impact of it, we found out in this particular building, which is located in Champaign-Urbana, so a good, tough heating and cooling environment. Champaign-Urbana is basically ground zero for North America for the worst weather in the world. We get Louisiana, hot, humid Gulf Stream air in the summer. We get Arctic blasts from Minneapolis in the winter. So we have to be able to manage it all. But on balance, in this particular building, by doubling the ventilation, the annual utility cost would not be impacted one bit. But improving the ventilation from here to here, in terms of cognition, it would be more than 10%. Now the building owners didn't go with our recommendations for a variety of reasons, and these are some of the issues that people have to contend with. But even though we showed them you would improve productivity, which had a value of $750,000 per year, without any change to your utility bill, and this was not without adding any kind of energy recovery devices, just crank up a fan and get more airflow in, put some CO2 sensors so it speeds it up as you need it. So very low capital cost to affect this change. And so that reduction or that improvement in salary, that's fewer employees that you'd have to hire, or more work that's getting done, allowing your business to expand. And you can roughly figure that a 10% impact on someone's cognitive productivity, they're making $50,000 a year, that's about $5,000. And another study, which is also cited on the back of this, done by Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, found that in businesses around North America, in the most severe climates, without adding any additional energy efficiency devices, but just cranking up the airflow from 20 CFM per employee to 40, that this would be about a $50 per employee cost per year for the energy side, balanced by, in their study, about a $6,000 productivity boost per employee per year. And even if they're off by a factor of 10 and they're just getting $600 per year more productivity from employees, because maybe they don't actually get that, or maybe it's improving their score on video games that they're playing during the workday, or who knows what. But it just makes the cost of the energy pale in comparison. And on the sick day side that I mentioned from Donald Milton's study, looking at how sick days change as you go from 20 to 40 CFM per employee, removing one sick day, a 40% reduction in sick days, has a value of, say, about $500 per day, or an overall cost savings of about $60,000, which again is quite substantial on its own against this utility payroll. And so why wouldn't you do that at a cost of $500 a day, at a savings of $500 a day, versus $50 per employee per year energy cost increase? So it just makes sense to get better air quality in a building. The difficulty for them, and for many others, the utility person is being told, get that utility bill down, and they don't give a damn about what the human resources person is going through to make up for hiring more people because of lowered productivity, because of more sick days. Somebody up above, and if you become that somebody, or are that somebody right now, managing or leading a facility of whatever nature, a school, a business, a church, that you really need to bring the maintenance and facility people together with the human resources, the human impact folks, to make decisions, because it's a full system. and humans are more valuable than energy. Another place where you get sick at the airport. The airports themselves, I typically find good air quality. I've spent several weeks on the tarmac. One of the things, one of our other companies, a company we started and have since sold, we designed these boxes and built these down in Bradenton, Florida area. These big boxes underneath the boarding bridge with the yellow ducts that blow air into the aircraft when it's on the ground. The boarding bridge above it, that tube that goes from the airport to the aircraft, most of these are stagnant. They have no ventilation airflow in them. And we sold this company 3 years ago. We started in 2013. I was able to take air quality data in the boarding bridge, but again, they could care less. We don't want any more expense. Passengers, so what if they complain or are getting sick? That's not our problem. Well, this is the airflow into the aircraft. So it shows when an aircraft is hooked up and then there's none. And then an aircraft is hooked up. And these might be, depending on the airline, JetBlue versus United. JetBlue is running people in and out on 20-minute cycles. And United may be hourly cycles. But in that boarding bridge, here's CO2 and volatile organic compounds. When people leave, they're unloading. It doesn't spike up so much because you get off the plane faster than you get on it, as you know directly. And then people are loading up, you're crowded into this tube, and the air quality is bad. Not only that you're jammed in there like a cattle car with people sneezing and coughing on you from all sides, but the air quality is just bad. And then it dies down when the unit's off and there's nobody essentially in there. And then the next plane comes in, it elevates again some, and then people are loading and it goes up again. And this is a likely place you're going to get sick, but I guarantee you it's still a forgotten place. So I'm hoping people are paying attention to that. We built the perfect office on campus, and unfortunately, because of disagreements we had with campus, as mechanical engineering building was being retrofitted, and you've seen the construction activities around it, and renovated, we proposed that you take an office, and we built a demonstration advising office, myself and Dean Ahmad Jasm, who you may have encountered, who's one of the best people on campus to encounter. And so whether you're needing to go to the dean's office for a good thing or a bad thing, he's a very good person to help you with your problems or other things to deal with. But he was the director of undergrad programs in mechanical engineering and one of my doctoral students many years ago. And when he needed to expand advising in mechanical engineering, we said, well, let's build this demonstration office, these things we've been talking about many years. He has a background in ventilation, both in industry as well as research. And so this office he expanded, we blocked part of the window because this building's highly over windowed. If you're on the south side, you're getting bombarded on a clear day with too much energy and heating and glare, and you can't see the classroom board. If you're on the north side, you're cold. So we insulated this top section, put in a fresh air vent, brought fresh air in, put in what's called a mini split heat pump, but basically this office had its own heating and cooling. And even though in our building and perhaps the other buildings you've been in, each year we get 2 letters from the facilities folks, one in the fall and one in the spring. And it tells us for about 2 weeks, you're going to be uncomfortable because we can't get the steam running to be heating you. And we can't get the air conditioning off. It takes a while. And then in the spring, the opposite letter, you're going to be uncomfortable because we can't get the steam off and we can't get the air conditioning going for a couple of weeks. So as we make that transition. So as we said to the facilities folks, well, we don't need you in the building. Just put in this little heat pump. And you've seen these around other places. Put in this little fresh air ventilator. It's got an energy recovery unit. And then put in a CO2 sensor, a VOC sensor. These are made by Honeywell. It costs a couple $100. And then we want our own individual comfort control. So all those things that 80% of the buildings that University of California's Center for the Built Environment folks have found are annoying people, a lack of individual comfort control and a lack of individual air quality control is put in this office. And the kicker was that relative to the standard renovation where they put in central air conditioning throughout the building, replacing these window units, since this building, when it was built in the 40s, 50s, did not have any air conditioning, that it would have been a $5 million capital cost savings. It would have been higher efficiency, and it would have been smart controlled, all online, all controlled through a dashboard, as well as individual control by the person occupying that office and classroom. But unfortunately, we lost the debate, and we have what we're getting, which is a building like so many on campus where somebody gets sick over on that side of the building, they're going to make somebody over on this side of the building sick. No, I'm not bitter, but anyway, let's go on. So we're going to talk some about COVID directly, the summer surge, and then where I think we're going in the fall. And these are, I'm not working with anyone. This research is not formally funded. It is an extension of what we do at our business, since we do this type of modeling and have been doing this for years, related to how to reduce colds and flus and how to keep the air at a high quality. Today's prevalence of asthma is about twice the amount of populace over the last 2 decades has respiratory sensitivities, whether increased allergenic responses to things like molds or other chemicals, or asthma triggered by, and we don't understand the cause. We don't understand if it's a cause by the built environment or something in our childhood growing up. But things have definitely changed, and changed significantly. And so we do these kind of studies for a variety of reasons, but more recently, since March, we focused our efforts directed toward COVID to try to understand it, figure out how to control it, and then ultimately snuffing it out. And one of the things we've found is that we feel this adequate ventilation, that it's making us sick. And one of the differences between now and 1918, when the pandemic came in 1918, a totally different virus, an influenza virus strain, that as it hit in the spring, but when people were still bundled up and sealed up in their homes as they sealed them in 1918, not as much as we do now, and with much more ventilation, much more infiltration, poor windows, many more construction flaws and openings, flue vents for cooking stoves and fireplaces, that once they hit the swing season, the spring, the virus dampened down and decayed. And 2 things that happened. One, influenza virus seems to be less viable in warmer, more humid conditions. And so the virus seemed to have lost its viability as we moved more into the summer season throughout North America and elsewhere in the world. But of course, there's still cooler places for it to hide out for a period of time in the southern hemisphere. So it's not gone. But at the same time, in 1918, as we went into an Illinois summer, it was hot as hell in a building. As soon as you got to a bit warmer spring, you opened the building up. The house smelled bad from the winter. It had odors in it, as well as you just wanted fresh air brought in. And so people opened the buildings up, and they stayed open throughout the summer. People slept on sleeping porches. They slept outside because inside it was always hotter than it was outside. Now, as we approach 70 degrees outdoors, as we'll look at, that's when we have air conditioning. So where from 50 to 70 degrees, we opened our homes and buildings up. Building controls would maximize the amount of fresh air going in when they would see outside was actually pretty nice compared to inside. People in their homes would open up windows and you go outside more. But once we got above 70 degrees, that's when we go back in buildings now, which we didn't in 1918, sealed ourselves back up with the same inadequate ventilation. And that was part of the summer surge. So here's the summer surge. This red oval, this is the number of total infections for a variety of countries. You can see that the US has left all of these other countries in the dust. We started experiencing rapid escalation of cases when Italy, Spain, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Iran, South Korea started to, and they handled it, and we absolutely did not. China, which we had plenty of time to observe months before, and what they did to manage it, we didn't learn our lessons there. And since I'm old enough to remember a few decades ago when the first SARS infection was growing in Asia, we responded before it even made it over to North America and other continents. And down by the South Farms, south of the playing fields, Lincoln and Florida, and just north of Vet Med, just on the south side of St. Mary's, you'll see two concrete pads. They've got some junk, some construction junk stored on them. Those are for SARS trailers. We responded at that time before the disease was known to have made it to North America, for a disease that was still in its early incubation stage, and we set up 2 SARS trailers to handle any potential infections on campus. And that's how we reacted, and others reacted around the country. And fortunately, it got controlled and handled and snuffed out, unlike the disaster that's unfolded in the US now. Now you can see as we grew, we were growing somewhat linearly, which is an interesting characteristic. This is a special mathematical boundary within the model that we'll discuss. And we were starting to get control of it, where we were starting to bend over the number of infections as time went on. But then mid-June, this acceleration infections happened. And now we're on the straight line path with nearly 5 million infections and associated fatalities. This new growth, this steeper increase in infections that we see, and again, there's a lot of folks trying to avoid responsibility that they are responsible for and trying to rewrite history, but this is a man-made disaster. We should be down with these other countries in managing this thing and snuffing it out. And our lack of coordination, lack of a coherent policy, this has been totally responsible for this runaway disaster. And part of this is careless reopening in the South, and the other half or portion of this is due to outdoor temperature, but in a manner, an unexpected manner, as far as I've been able to see, in comparison to 1918, as people were driven inside as temperature got warmer and then propagated up north, and we saw an infection surge happen. So this modeling that I do, and you can read more detail about it, this thing called medRxiv. If you do Ty Newell medRxiv, you'll kick up a paper. But this is a pre-publication, a non-reviewed, non-peer-reviewed publication site. And with the nature of COVID, people are putting manuscripts up before they're reviewed to try to do it in a timely manner, because we're undergoing this disaster right now. So whether the paper I've written is a bunch of garbage or deserves much more critical analysis, as well as others, you need to be wary of that, and want you to think. But in any case, this describes this model as well as this temperature effect that I've observed and think occurs. We'll see in the fall. But basically, this model is that the growth rate of infections is simply based on something I call an infection parameter. And the rough definition of the infection parameter I've developed is that it's the number of people who become infected per infectious person over a 2-week period. So it has a few things built into it, but it's similar to something called a basic reproduction number, or an R0 that the epidemiologists use. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm going to use whatever I develop. And mathematically, this parameter, when it has a value of E, logarithm E, 2.72, we're at the boundary between accelerating or growing infections versus decelerating or decaying infections. And this infection parameter, I've found, can be described or characterized by two other parameters that are independent of the disease, but help characterize, and at least for me, conceptually picture things I'm doing that impact the ability of the disease to spread. So the infection parameter is a function of something I call a social distance index. This is a value I grabbed from a website, the University of Maryland, and this is cited in the paper. I go to it, and it's from their Transportation Institute, where they take cell phone data and GPS data from vehicles, and they put various weighting factors on the number of trips per day somebody's taken, the number of miles they've driven, the amount of times they've gone outside their house, where their phone is or their vehicle. And at a social distance index of 0, that's total interaction, and 100, that's perfect isolation. And one thing to emphasize, if we had perfectly isolated, and we have done a very poor job of isolating, no matter how much it felt like we might have isolated, we did a very poor job of isolating, that we would snuff this thing out in 3 to 4 weeks. We would, by totally isolating anyone that's infectious and totally isolating anyone that's not, this thing would be gone. Okay? Normal social distance index from the University of Maryland site for most regions around the country was about 20 pre-COVID. And when we went into peak isolation in March and April, it went up to about 60. And currently we're at about 32. The other factor the infection parameter depends on is something I call a transmission efficiency, or G. And G, I give a value of 1 relative to the reference. When we were shutting down, I looked at that initial data where we were not face masking or staying 6 feet apart, or still roughly interacting, shaking hands, hugging, or doing things when we did interact. As we were going into isolation, that has a disease efficiency of 1, or basically under normal interactions. Now, New York, and this is for the US as a whole, New York actually had an early infection efficiency that was greater than 1, about 1.4 or so, reflecting that it's a much denser, much more reliant on mass transit than, say, in Atlanta or other areas of the country, Seattle. And so it makes sense that it might have more efficient means of moving the virus from one person to another at a similar level of social distance. So the transmission efficiency is really something that's a parameter that describes the how many people are wearing masks, whether you're staying 6 feet apart, whether surfaces are getting sanitized, whether the ventilation is higher or lower, and other factors that might be put into that as well. And so, you might be playing beer pong and have a social distance index of, say, 20. But the transmission efficiency, if you're playing as you normally would before pre-COVID, that might have an infection transmission efficiency of 1. But if you're playing beer pong, wearing masks, having some type of protective shield and higher ventilation, maybe you knock that down to 0.1 or 0.2. So that's how these are somewhat two independent parameters that describe the infection parameter. The other thing are the number of people that are infectious. And this is a moving window. People that became infectious about 2 weeks ago, COVID's got roughly a 2-week infectious period. They're moving out of that infection window, whether they've recovered or they've died, but they're no longer shedding virus, and new people are coming in. And this is extremely important because right now, for example, New York, California, and Florida all have about 400, 450 total infections. But in New York, a very small fraction of those are still infectious because they've been able to drop the number of infections down and manage this crisis, where Florida and California are still in the throes of accelerating infections. Now, this infection parameter, looking at it for the US as a whole, but of course, different regions need to be characterized differently. And as I mentioned, when this infection parameter is 2.7, if we're above it, infections are accelerating. And initially on, before we started gaining control in the US, and this is dominated by New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Illinois, Michigan. But as we got it in control and started managing it, we were bouncing around 2.7. We actually, for the US as a whole, went below, and this was just a projection that I made in early mid-June, saying that it looks like by July, we're going to be going into this region. But then we had this jump, and this jump in mid-June that is making all the news about infections, but now coming down, and I'll show you newer stuff. So this goes to mid-July. Part of this was due to outdoor temperature changes up north, and part of it was due to irresponsible, careless reopenings down south. If we look at the infection parameter on a different map, relative to the social distance index that I get from this University of Maryland site, and then this infection efficiency, which I've scaled relative to the pre-COVID, pre-masking, pre-6-foot isolation and other measures, and mapping infection parameter versus these two items. In May, we were about here. And one thing you notice, we're kind of bouncing around the US as a whole, but even regionally in different states, around this 2.7. And this is linear total growth of infections, basically the number of people going into infectious versus the number of people coming out. That number is linearly growing. And then as we hit mid-June, and we had this infection parameter jump, it largely occurred without any change of social distance. So this is businesses reopening, but reopening with more caution applied, maybe increasing infections. So, hey, we better start wearing masks. So now maybe 10, 20% started wearing masks, still reopening. And then over here, kind of stopped as far as the reopening. It slowed down. The social distance index in the US just kind of stayed the same. But then we jumped up to almost doubling the transmission efficiency. Then we started getting the news reports. Oh, damn, look at what Florida's doing and what's happening in Texas and California and Arizona. And so we naturally, without any coherent, coordinated guidance, people just naturally started to distance again. And because they weren't acting much different as far as trying to avoid handshakes or wearing masks or things like that, we were following roughly a constant transmission efficiency line. And if we were to manage it without changing the efficiency, we need to, again, distance up to about 36, whatever that means as far as how you're actually going out. Now, this model lets us compare real data, real time. So as of July or so, I had started this model in mid-June when I saw the infection parameter take off. But because it takes about a week of incubation and then 2 weeks that you're infectious, there's a time lag. So even though I could see infection parameter and the factors impacting it jump, we weren't seeing this infection jump. We were still here when I made this plot. And then as of early July, and I made it, this thing was following these paths. I estimated that we would stay at about a social distance index of about 33 with a transmission efficiency of 19. As we'll see a little bit later, we fortunately have started to get on a downward path. But I think we're right now operating as this rudderless ship where one region or another, like Missouri right now, starts having uncontrolled growth without a coordinated way to manage this thing. So infections rise, people get horrified as they see the news or know somebody that got sick. They start getting more serious about wearing a mask, not going out. That tends to dampen and decay, but it takes 1, 2, 3 weeks to notice that impact. They drop down below the accelerating growth level, the infection parameter of 2.72. They relax. Businesses want to reopen. They're going bankrupt every day. So there's another force trying to get people to interact again. People are sick of not seeing each other, and it takes us back up above it. And I think that's where the US is operating rather than actively managing this thing. So just looking at the current trends, and since you have control over this as you rewatch it, I'm assuming you stop to go to the bathroom, get an untold number of cups of coffee to withstand the monotone of my voice and the fire hose of information coming out of this. But, and so forgive me for moving on, but I'm assuming that you're going to revive and increase your metabolism periodically as needed. I've been known to reduce people's metabolism in thermodynamics lectures or ones like this to dangerously low levels of activity. So do what you need to do to revive yourselves. So when we look at the states as far as its infection parameter, California, Florida, North Carolina, California's never gotten control of this thing. They've stayed above this 2.7 accelerating region, and you've got to build up enough infections. That's the other side of this infection modeling. So the number of infections you have times this parameter that's built into it, that finally builds up. And now California, as they also had, there's a slight temperature effect going on in California, but also getting sick of being isolated and people coming out and reopening. Took them up here, and now they're above 400,000 infections and grappling with that. Like Florida, like North Carolina, like Texas. They've since come down and they're now waffling around here. Florida similarly, but even more irresponsible in reopening, meeting together at crowded bars and on beaches. And now they've moved down to where they're almost in control, essentially flattening it. And North Carolina too. But that's very different than, as we'll see, with states like Illinois and Michigan and the northern states that went through this crisis earlier. So California, Florida, when they initially in March, April, May started isolating and started then wearing masks, they came down from a high infection transmission efficiency and relatively low social distance index. And then on this map started moving down, reopening businesses, but then started, they didn't get their transmission efficiency lower than say 0.3. And they started going up in increased infections. And over in California, dropping down initially as they isolated, coming from about 20 or so, where most places around the US had been, and stopping at about 60. And then again, kind of bouncing around as they tried to reopen, but again, not getting their transmission efficiency lowered than about 30% and starting to climb up as they hit this. And that's been the acceleration that they've currently experienced. Illinois and Michigan, we followed similar paths. We had these horrifying infection spread, and Michigan centered around Detroit, Illinois around Chicago, metropolitan areas, but now more spread diffusely through rural areas in the country. But Illinois struggled more to try to get below this mathematical boundary of about 2.7. Michigan got below it. We're doing well, but kind of bouncing up and down as protesters would run around the state capitol, and then some numbnuts would say, liberate Michigan and crap like that, and face masks aren't needed. But there's some kind of limit drawing us around this no growth boundary. This spurious data from Michigan was a change in their counting methods. And so that's what happened. But both of us were doing great up until mid-June, and then a jump, not the reopening movement toward lower social index, more social interaction, but at the same social distance index, a jump up in transmission efficiency. And this is what I found to be related to going up above 70 degrees outdoor temperatures, going from nice spring weather where our buildings are open and we're outside, but getting cooped up inside with inadequate ventilation. And then now getting, again, more measures put in place, more serious about face masks, more serious about some isolation. We've gotten back down to this level again. To me, it's kind of like a limit cycle that's been going on where we go above and below this accelerated transmission efficiency and decelerated, but we haven't descended like in Italy, a Germany, a South Korea to a value much lower for a sustained period of time, a value of 2 in infection parameter like they have, and held it there where we could decay this thing and snuff it out. When we look on this plot for Illinois and Michigan, in March, we are increasing social distance index, isolating ourselves more. A drop due to outdoor temperature going from above 50 degrees, going from 40 to 50 degrees in, say, Illinois and Michigan. And this was a helpful bump because we were opening up homes and buildings, getting more fresh air, getting outside more. Illinois continued urging people to wear face masks and isolate as they started to decrease the social distance index, reopening. And we were moving along here, effectively reopening, getting down to 30. And then this unexpected jump up without much change in social distance index. This was when we went above 70 degrees outdoors and people went back into their homes. A similar trend occurred in Michigan and other states. And this plot, which is comfort conditioning energy, data that we've taken in field studies, but for 13 identical homes, these happen to be in Vermont, but it doesn't matter where they are. All homes show this characteristic. And what you find is that the energy per day for here heating, when it's below 50 degrees, as it gets colder and colder, the energy you need to run your heat pump or furnace goes up. As you get to 50, we start to bottom out. And then as you get back up to 70, it starts going up again. So this kind of minimal energy for comfort conditioning. And of course, there's people that still like to heat their home at 70 degrees and people that like to air condition their home at 50. So that's why it looks like a shotgun hit this. This is daily data from 13 homes over about a 1 to 2 year period with 1 to 5 very non-identical people. So 13 homes, these are factory built homes that were just plopped on a pad, very high efficiency homes. But all homes show this characteristic. Around 50 to 70 degrees is where we get to enjoy spring and hopefully enjoy fall. So it matches up. And when we turn this infection parameter, say, to another dimension where we look at it versus average outdoor temperature, for Illinois, as we were working to socially isolate and get transmission efficiency down, we were around here, but you can see that there's a fairly sharp drop as we moved up above 50 degrees as we went into our spring season. And then we continued struggling and trying to get infection parameter down. And once we emerged from 70, this is where we had the unexpected leap in infection parameter. Michigan, similar thing, fighting to get people to wear masks, to isolate seriously, doing some dipsy doodles in this viewpoint of this infection parameter, but getting it down, and then without any significant change in social distance or transmission efficiency practices, they jumped up. And then as they go above 70, it stayed up there until they then tried to counter the growing infections. As we look at New York and Ohio, similar things on this temperature map, a drop down when they went above 50, stayed down, they came out the other side 70, people started using air conditioning and going inside more, it went up. Ohio, the same thing, once they got above 50, it stayed fairly level, they go above 70, they go inside with inadequate ventilation, they get sick more often. So among the things we need to be doing in our buildings, the 3 guidelines, more fresh air, improve filtration, and hopefully add ultraviolet. So where are we going? How's school reopenings? Things that I'm sure are of concern to you these days as you're thinking about coming back here, or family and others at home, and schools opening for perhaps siblings, and the outdoor effect as people are talking about this fall wave from 1918. Well, to update where we are now, where those took us through where we've been in July, the infection parameter for the US, and as we had this July increase, this July surprise that did not occur with the 1918 pandemic, but I feel did occur this time through temperatures going above 70 and irresponsible reopening in southern states, and now fighting it and getting back down to this level where I think, again, we'll be waffling around. We'll be hitting a limit cycle as a region gets horrified. They've gone into the accelerating range. They get control. They drop down a bit. They relax. They let their guard down. They start to interact more, and they go up again. I think until we have a coordinated public action, COVID's going to be with us through the rest of this year, through December at least. And so when we look at that on this other map and now extended out to current times, coming through May, as we were reducing social distance index, increasing social interactions, but bouncing around this infection parameter of 2.7 and adjusting transmission efficiency as needed to try to get control, wearing more face masks, cleaning surfaces more, staying further apart, even though still interacting. And we went through the stage where we got down to this level in June, early to mid-June, and then we hit a transmission efficiency of about 0.1. And in general, the US just kept linearly growing, still didn't have it in control, but we jumped up without any significant change of social distance and social interactions. And this is where we went through most regions of the US increasing above 70 degrees, going inside, using air conditioning. We reacted to horrifying news stories by increasing the social distance index, isolating in our homes and buildings more. And today, now, we're starting to reopen again, and we're moving on this path, but more and more people, as I observed going to South Carolina the week before last, more and more people wearing face masks where I thought they might be more resistant to it. But South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, a lot of face mask wearing there. So people are taking it serious. So the model updated to today, the number of infections per day, originally this path looked like it might go up to 400,000 infections today. But the reaction of people to horrifying news looks like we've gotten it into this no growth of infections on average for the US. And I think we'll be moving somewhere in this range for a while as we move with time. But as we look at what's going to happen in our schools and with temperatures in the fall, where people are fearful of this fall temperature effect, there will be a temperature effect, but it's going to be the opposite of what occurred in the early summer as we came from late winter into early spring, and we had a hidden but beneficial drop in northern states of infection parameter as we went up above 50 degrees and we got outside and opened buildings up. But then, unlike the Spanish flu, the 1918 pandemic, we didn't stay outside through the summer. When we went above 70, we closed up, and then we had this unexpected jump, this summer surge in those areas going through that temperature range, coupled with the irresponsible reopening measures. And that took us into that accelerated period. Now, as we've gotten back down to where we don't have accelerating growth, here and there we do, and other places not. As we go toward nice weather again in the fall, I expect us to see a beneficial drop due to outdoor temperature. And that will help many regions of the country. It will lead to as we then think, oh, we have it in control and we see some decrease, because once we come out the other side of that and we drop below 50, we're going to see a bump up as people close their homes and buildings up, furnaces come on, and we're again sealed inside with inadequate ventilation. Now, coupling that with school reopenings, in order to model that, I did two simple things. I said, as we go into the fall and we drop below 70, but before we drop below 50, we see about a 25 to 33% drop in some places like Illinois. It seemed like it was a stronger drop in transmission efficiency compared to, say, New York or North Carolina, where it might have been 25% drop. And then school reopenings, to model that by saying that, okay, that means people come out of their homes more for those schools that will have physical contact. So there's going to be a reduction in social distance index. And I just said, let's say 20%. So if a place right now is at 40, they're going to drop to 32. And that will happen during the month of September as schools reopen. So a very simple basis. And for example, then here's the social distance index from University of Maryland for 10 different states, New York, Florida, Washington. It's not meant to be very readable, but you can expand this on your own and just see that most places in March, February went from a social distance index of 20 up to about 60 to 70. New York was the champ in closing down, and very difficult there in their environment. And then as we've reopened, we've come back down, and on average, we're somewhere around 30 now. And we've come back up with some horrifying news of the infections, but it looks like some places may be coming back down again. But I just said, okay, let's just continue this out through December. And then with school reopenings on the social distance index, the same model, except once we hit September, let's say this interaction reduces the social distance index for each of these locations by 20%, and it does it through September. But then as we perhaps see some horrifying trends, we close down in some manner or distance again in some manner to take care of it. And then as far as temperature and the impact of school, just looking at this infection parameter map for New York, Washington, and Georgia, just a sampling of those 10 locations. As we dropped the infection parameter through social distancing and reduced transmission efficiency, we went through the surge, again, for different reasons in different locations. But now, as we've gotten that in control, and in this case, Georgia, Washington, New York, we're about here right now. And if we use the temperature, outdoor temperature, we would say, for example, Washington would have a temperature benefit right now because they're in that 50 to 70 degree window. And then somewhere around November, they'll bump back up. So this is a temperature effect shown here, but no school reopenings. And Georgia and New York, different times a year when they have that window in different lengths of time. We add in a 20% reduction of the social distance index coupled with that temperature, and we see this beneficial drop, say for Washington, but then because the lower the social distance index goes, it's non-linearly related to infection parameter. It goes up more than it comes down for equal changes of social distance index. So it's enough with a 20% reduction to take them into this accelerated infection growth. And then once schools reclose or other actions happen to lower below that, and also taking beneficial effect in September, which for these 3 regions should happen, and then coming back up as we get to colder temperatures in the winter. So that's the basis for this model. And again, this isn't meant to be readable, but the base difference among these, and I know I'm at my time limit, so I'm just about wrapped up, that New York, because of the low number of active infections, I expect to be minimally impacted, and beneficially, if schools do not physically reopen, beneficially, the outdoor temperature will also further help to dampen, unlike the 1918 pandemic that caused an increase. California, Florida, trouble controlling it now. The large number of current infections, even though total infections are similar to New York, because most of these folks are already out of the infectious period where most of these are just in it. They're going to go screaming. And you can't see where they go here. I'll show you in a table, but they'll go screaming even more here. And school reopenings in several other states, which even though they're at a low level now, and without school reopenings could somewhat gain control and also take beneficial impact of temperature changes coming up September, October, November. They're going to perhaps lose control and have to gain control again. This shows the new infections per day and similar type of things. This is New York data here, a whole bunch of other data. Again, not easy to see, but I am going to post this in medRxiv so you can see these details better. And I'll let Professor Wynn know when that's posted. But losing control and many more infections per day, perhaps as much as 60, 70,000 infections per day in southern states and others that have lost control versus say 15,000. This table wraps it up. New York currently, as of the end of July, with about 400,000 infections, with no school, but a temperature effect, perhaps by the end of December, growing somewhat, but not bad. If they didn't have the temperature effect, perhaps growing more, but still in control. With school reopening and a temperature effect, growing more than they would have without physical school reopening for the assumed change of social distance. And without the temperature effect, it's actually a good beneficial effect, much higher with school reopening. So I anticipate somewhere in this, they've been there before, that they can handle it. Look at Florida, similar number of infections, but because of the active cases, that if there is, because of the temperature effect, even in Florida, a slight advantage over no school with no temperature effect, but with the temperature effect, but reopening in a careless manner, going up to perhaps 5.5 million. And if the temperature effect doesn't really occur well in Florida, perhaps 6.5 million, with a September bump in school reopening and reduction of social distancing. California is similar to Florida, and then everywhere in between. So I'll end there. This is a long extended, but thank you very much for letting me cover all of those topics. And I hope that, among other things, monitor CO2, get yourself a meter, share in the cost of a meter, take it with you to restaurants, to stores, to church, to classrooms. Find out what your environment's made of. Use the mask. Shun people that aren't. Stay away from them. Let businesses know you're not going to use them if they're not. Also, no shirts, no shoes, no masks, no service. Support and thank essential workers and medical staff. As much as we might be fatigued, we're at the very beginning of this thing. Where we are headed without any control, when this thing would run to an equilibrium level of infections, if a vaccine does not appear that's viable, will be 200 million infections. That's the normal course of this in an uncontrolled manner, in an uncoordinated and non-coherent manner. 200 million. So as horrifying as 4 to 5 million is right now, we're at the beginning. Thank you very much. There's a number of references and a few other slides back there for you to make use of. Have a great day. Bye-bye.